and we're going to go through the Unit 2 Mind and Body Investigations and some final tips from me for getting you through tomorrow's exam. So, first of all, if I can work out how I'm going to share things, it is that one, I think. Nope, not that one. Let's go with Showcase. And I want you lot to see from this one. And you will see, hopefully, this particular thing. So, if I go back, can you actually see what I'm doing? Or have I made a big mistake? Right, can you see my PowerPoint? What did I do wrong? Aha, that one. Nope, not that one. I really thought it was screen share. Can you see? Why can't you see my PowerPoint? Can you see this, guys? No. It's there. Why can't you see it? Okay, what am I doing wrong? I did this okay last night, but it's not working this time. Settings. Nope, it's not there. Showcase. No, I asked for you to open that one. More. Nope. Why did I think it was the cameraman? No. What did I do? Is it that one? Present to everyone. Yeah. And I want you to see the slide. Right, can you see that but still see me? Hopefully you can. So this is the first part of the PowerPoint, and it's about when you get in the exam. I think I've screwed it up again. Yes. I don't want to do that one. What do I want to do? I might have to abandon this because I can't remember what I was doing. Right. Can you see that in your thing? Why can't I do that? Present. Present from beginning. Right. Can you actually see this? So, when you get in the exam, breathe. Take 1 or 2 deep breaths, and then I want you to read the question really carefully, at least twice, so you actually know what you're talking about. It will always say examine and comment as part of the question, either after a quote or in part of the whole entire question. And there will always be somewhere the phrase with reference to the topic you've studied, so that you know to expect. The next thing you need to do is to figure out what the focus of the question is. So is it asking you to look at dualism first? Or is it asking you to focus on materialism? Is it asking you to have special reference to something else? Or is it asking you to simply just examine the question? Now, the checklist, which I'll share with you in a moment, is the one that you've also should have memorised from lessons before. And it's what you should include. And if you make sure you include all that, then you know you won't have missed anything. If you spend 5 to 10 minutes at the start of the exam going through these things, it will help you calm down, it will help you organise your ideas, and it then gives you that tick list to check off so that you will write the best possible essay. Okay, now I'm going to head back after my cute little picture to trying to share with you and make sure you've actually seen what I've been seeing. So that's not the bit I want. I have to click on this. Did you see any of the PowerPoint? If you do, can you send me a little chat? Because I'm going to set the is it that one? Which one do I want to share? That one maybe? Share? If I share that, that's not the one, is it? Stop screen sharing. Stop presenting. And what did we do last night? There's my chat. Now, you're viewing me, but I can't seem to show you what I want to show you, which is really irritating. Which is obviously that, but I'm not sure if you're actually seeing it. I haven't figured out if that then allows you to see. That's what you're seeing on my thingy, but it's not, is it? You're just seeing me still, which really isn't helpful. And I had this working perfectly last night. Right, showcase is disabled. That's what it was last night. Screen share. Share the content of your screen with Google Hangouts. Choose what you'd like to share. Entire screen. Okay. Oh, no, don't do that. That just looks weird. Stop. Stop screen sharing. Right. Oh, this is so annoying. I am really sorry, guys. Can you see when I click onto that? Is that what you can see? Or do you just see me still? You still see me. What was it that I clicked on? See, this is what the title is. I'm sure it was screen share. Ah, there we go. Share. Right, yay, finally we got there. Right, so this is what you can see. And I am going to click on just so I can get my own one myself. So this is what you should be seeing as I click over it. This is what you should get. So the reminder of the essential views of the philosophers. Now, first of all, what you've got to do is you need to reference to the ideas of physicalism, monism, and materialism in the introduction. It doesn't need to be a massive introduction, okay? They don't want a load of waffle because you've got quite a lot of content to get through, so you really do need to get to the point straight away. Then it doesn't matter which order you do them in, and obviously this is only a checklist. So if the question itself is asking you directly to start looking at, say, is dualism, examine and comment on the claim that dualism is the best answer to the mind-body problem. If that's what you're actually, that's the question, then you're not going to start by talking about materialism as such. And you would also reference in your intro, you would more likely to reference dualism as well. So, but this is just obviously, this is going to be like your checklist that I'd want you to scribble down on the exam paper when you get in there. So talking about Gilbert Ryle, talking about his idea of the ghost in the machine, use that as your particular quote. Remember, you've got the examples of the university and the team spirit. So he's a hard materialist, as we remember, which means he believes there is no concept of the soul. He says that the idea of a concept of the soul is a category mistake. So that's something else you can reference in there of him. And he would always say that there is no mind-body problem because there is no separate kind of mind or soul. We are just one physical entity. So you could actually refer back and say he is a physicalist. Then we've got our dear friend Richard Dawkins, and he's the one that says, well, actually, all that we are is just bytes and bytes of digital information. He has no reference whatsoever to the idea of a separate mind. Anything that we may attribute to our mind is purely out of natural selection and evolution in his viewpoints. And again, he would be classed as his hard materialist. Some of you may want to, after that, include either talking about Thomas Hobbes or Terry Bisson, depending on which one you like the best. So either or if you want to include both, it's entirely up to you, but you can cope without having to share those ones if you really don't remember. But Ryle and Dawkins are the really important hard materialists. Then we've got John Hick and his replica theory. And you need to, first of all, explain what the replica theory is. The idea that the minute we die on this earth, that a replica is created in an alternate kind of existence. And you need to be able to explain the example of John Smith being recreated and the idea of with New York, etc. Remember to mention the fact that John Hick is a soft materialist, and he says there is a mind, but it is totally unable to exist separately from the body. Entirely up to you, and I realise I'm just saying a lot of at the moment. Sorry for that. You can at this point discuss the idea of Jesus' resurrection, because soft materialism allows for the concept of bodily resurrection. Because if it's a bodily resurrection, there is no soul that exists outside of the body. So you can include that there if you want to, which really gives you some nice AO2 content. As I said, you can link it to Jesus and bodily resurrection, and you can also link it to St. Paul. We went through a couple of quotes yesterday that you've got. There should be on the quotes on the previous PowerPoint that you've actually had. At some point, I will do going through the PowerPoint and record it like this one. Then you must include Mackie in response to the idea of bodily resurrection, and particularly directly at John Hick's replica theory. The idea of the chalkboard, that if you wrote a message on the chalkboard and rubbed it out and wrote it again in exactly the same place, exactly the same kind of thing, pretty much tracing the lines, it still would be a different thing. And Mackie's the suggestion is therefore that the replica theory, that replica is not the same as the original. At this point, you might want to use the example of a priceless painting, for example, a Monet. If there was an exact replica, it would have nowhere near the same kind of value as the original picture in the first place. So you can use that as an AO2 critique. Then you're going to be looking at moving on to dualism. And dualism, you have to first of all include Plato. You're going to be talking about the forms, the idea that he suggested that there is enough evidence that there has to be something prior to bodily existence, and that there is also a post-mortem existence, and how this would support the dualist perspective. And as part of that, you can use the example that Socrates gave about the slave boy who could solve a geometry puzzle despite not having any education, which led Socrates and therefore Plato to suggest that that itself was evidence of a previous existence, which would therefore require an immortal soul, which would therefore require the idea of what dualism is. Again, depending on what the actual question is, it really depends on how you organise your ideas. If you decide that the focus is on materialism, you start with materialism. If it seems that the focus is dualism, you start with dualism. If you're not clear on what the focus is, just go for materialism, soft materialism, dualism. Right, now Descartes is our next dualist philosopher, and he talked about obviously the idea I think therefore I am, the Latin cogito ergo sum, and his particular link directly to dualism is that because he knew he could not trust the evidence that his physical body was giving him, his senses, and he knew that the only reason he knew he was existing was because he was sitting there thinking. So for him, this meant there must have been something that would exist independent of the body, therefore a soul. And Descartes, if you want to be really posh, was classed as a substance dualist. Then it leads quite nicely into St. Thomas Aquinas and his concept of the anima, that which animates us. He believed that the soul is what gives us kind of our reality, that without the anima, we are simply a physical shell. So Aquinas was clearly a dualist. And as a Christian, his thoughts perfectly link into the concept of immortality of the soul and the Christian belief in that, and also therefore will allow for the concept of the spiritual resurrection, because the soul is immortal and will go to a place where God is. As part of that, you can link to a more modern philosopher, being Keith Wald, who again, a dualist, and used a reference from the creation story in Genesis about God breathed the soul into us like dust. The idea that God gave a soul after he had actually created Adam's body, clearly suggesting that there is a distinct and separate entity, being the soul. I've already made the link to Christianity and immortality of the soul. There is the reference with St. Paul that you can use. He says about the body which is sown perishable, i.e. the human physical body, is raised imperishable. And there are also various other quotes within that reference, which is in 1 Corinthians. So Christianity, this concept of heaven and existing in paradise for eternity, focuses on the immortality of the soul. And these Christian beliefs therefore lend a lot of weight to the idea of a dualist perspective. The one key critique that you want to include for your AO2 content to get those extra marks is the problem of personal identity. And I know some of you have struggled with this in the past. Simply put, and I do go through this towards the end of this little broadcast, problem of personal identity really focuses on the idea of, okay, what is it that makes us us? How can, if we survive after this earthly life, will we be recognised? Is it our external features, our physical features? Is it something else that's within us? Is it the way we act? How does that relate to these ideas of a hard materialist perspective, soft materialist, and dualist? And for the dualist perspective, particularly if you're talking about immortality of the soul and the spiritual resurrection, we don't have a physical body. And most of our physical characteristics are what most people identify as us. So the idea is, if we are a soul in an afterlife, how will our friends and family and our loved ones recognise that it's us? And part of the reason that a huge proportion of humanity have and still do believe in an afterlife is linked to this comforting element that if you suffer in this life, you'll have a great afterlife. And when you lose your loved ones and friends and stuff like that in this life, then you'll have the opportunity to spend eternity with them. But the problem of personal identity raises, well, how will you know it's them? How will they recognise you? And the Bible doesn't necessarily provide this answer. St. Paul just mentions about a spiritual body given by God, and there is no definite answer to this. After that, you can then look at reincarnation. Now, reincarnation is a central belief in the Eastern religions, and I would highly recommend that you focus primarily on the Hindu belief and also the Buddhist belief in rebirth, because both of these give you some good information. Now, when Hinduism talks about the soul being the Atman, and it suggests in there that there is a continuity of memory, so that the soul should remember its previous lives. Well, again, that could cause a possible problem with personal identity, because of the fact that, well, which particular person were you? Are you all at the same time, or who do you identify with? Although reincarnation does support the idea of dualism, because if you don't take on the strict perception that the soul remembers its previous lives, you are starting a new life every time in a new body, and that body is the only one that counts that particular time, so there is no issue with personal identity. However, if you're looking at the Buddhist perspective of rebirth as well, again, they are all totally distinct lives, and there is no suggestion of any connection. So that clearly avoids any problems in relation to personal identity, which is obviously what I've just explained. So the Eastern beliefs do not necessarily suffer from the problem of personal identity, but in fact, the idea of the soul moving from one body to another, as in reincarnation and rebirth, is a clear belief that supports the dualist idea that the mind and body are definitely two distinct entities. So, how are you going to actually explain that? Well, I tried to, as I was just discussing those key points, give you these ideas. For me, I would, as I go down my checklist that I've written at the beginning of the exam, I would look at the person, I would explain their idea, I would give a quote and then an example to illustrate my knowledge. So hopefully you will have actually written down the checklist and not just remembered it, because when you're in exam, it doesn't add it. And it's really quite nice and reassuring for you to actually go through and tick off all what you've actually answered. Makes you feel a bit better and a bit more secure in your knowledge. But as you go through it, as you go through each of the people that you've written down from that previous checklist, what you need to do is obviously name the philosopher. The surname is fine. If you can't remember the first name because you go blank, absolutely fine. And again, if you can't remember who particularly said what, then just say a hard materialist or a dualist or the soft materialist, again, is fine. Ideally, you should by now know the surnames of Ryle, Dawkins, Hobbes, Hick, etc. You then need to really clearly explain what their view was. Make sure it is obvious to the examiner that you know what you're talking about. So a proper full paragraph on each person is ideal. And within that paragraph, you should include a quote. So for Gilbert Ryle, we're going to talk about Ghost in the Machine. You might want to use the quote of the category mistake. Obviously, with Aquinas, you're going to use the anima. With Descartes, you can use I think, therefore I am. So they're all the quotes that you would actually use. And an example to illustrate their view. So this could be an example that the philosopher has given themselves. So in Ryle's case, he talks about the cricket match with the foreigner and where the team spirit is. He also talks about the university. When you talk about Hicks replica theory, he gives the example of John Smith. You can also make up your own example in that position if you want to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding. The examiners, as I say, always just give you credit for good information. They don't mark negatively. If you leave stuff out, you don't lose marks because of it. They just mark you positively. So if your brain pops up with a nice example that helps you remember that particular person, stick it in. And if you can't think of an example, don't panic. But good paragraph. And if you can remember the person, idea, quote, example, that will really help you. Right, the AO2 content. I know some of you struggled in the past with this a little bit. It is worth 15 marks. And as we've constantly gone over the fact that, yes, the grade boundaries are quite high and there are only 4 or 5 marks between grade boundaries. So the AO2 content can really boost your grades. So when you're examining each philosopher idea, so say you've gone through the idea of Ryle, say you've gone through the idea of hard materialism, you need to make some comment about whether it is the most sensible explanation. Does it justify the fact that mind and body are the same in the materialist perspective? You can say that Dawkins and Ryle present a very convincing argument for the suggestion that the mind and body are the same and that we are purely just one physical being. That sentence on its own is enough to include as some AO2 content. If you can think about how you might criticize their viewpoint, then again, that's even better. That will give you more marks. But again, you don't lose out for forgetting certain stuff as long as you've got the main points. Now, when you go through your mental tick list, you will look at Mackey and the chalkboard analogy. And as you're talking about the chalkboard analogy, that will count as AO2 because you are evaluating Hicks replica theory. That counts as the comment bit and will give you your AO2. So using all of that, and then if you choose to include like Williams and Vardy, which the other ones that relate to Mackey's soft materialism, that counts as AO2. And if you include the idea of Jesus' resurrection and St. Paul at that point, that again counts as AO2 because you are commenting on it, you are addressing the issues. So when you look at dualism and you say that immortality of the soul and spiritual resurrection and reincarnation are provide support for the dualist perspective as outlined by your philosophers, all of that is AO2 because you are showing that those Christian and Eastern religious beliefs do actually link directly to the perspectives you are looking at and can provide support for them. So just by being careful and making sure you're clear about how you're relating it to the ideas, so making sure that you do relate the idea of resurrection to, or bodily resurrection to soft materialism and spiritual resurrection in support of dualism, using the terms in support of will help you achieve your AO2. So the linking back to the question. Now, some of you, when you've done mock papers, and even when you've been doing your really good kind of perfect exams, have struggled with this a little. And it's just a simple habit that you need to get into that ideally you should have got into by now. And that is to always refer a link back to the question. And it is very simple for you to do. So the best answers, the ones that are going to get you B's and A grades, make regular references or links back to the question. Because what the examiner wants to see, not that you've just rewritten an entire memorized essay. They want to know that you are picking your points and aiming them directly at trying to answer the question. So use the actual wording for the question. So if it says to you, examine and comment on the claim that materialism is the best solution to the mind-body problem, when you finish looking at Dawkins and Ryle, you can say, clearly, from the evidence provided by both of these philosophers, materialism does appear to be the best solution to the mind-body problem. And then you've made this link direct. You said to the examiner, look, I've looked at these two things because that's what's answering the question you've given me. You don't have to do it after every single point. So you don't have to necessarily refer back to the question after Ryle, and then after Bisson, and then after Hobbes, if you include all those, and then after Dawkins. But you need to, these are the minimum that you need to do. You need to do it once you've looked at hard materialism. So whether you do 2, 3, 4 philosophers, whatever, you must make sure after you've looked at hard materialism, you put in a decent sentence that refers back to the question. You then do the same after your discussion of soft materialism. So Hick, Mackey, anyone else, then that gives you a really good kind of referring back to, because you've looked at the fors and against of replica theory. And then again after dualism, again, you could do it after the first little bits. You might want to do Plato, Socrates, Descartes, and refer back. And then because Aquinas and Keith Wald go together and link quite nicely with the religious bits, you might want to refer to them afterwards. So when you do immortality of the soul and spiritual resurrection and dualism, refer back to the question once you've examined that. And the same when you've looked at reincarnation in support of dualism and any issues, refer back to it as well. Now, the conclusion, that went very quickly. The conclusion should, and you must do a proper conclusion because that's what gets you the top levels. I should either start your conclusion by referencing the question, or you should end your conclusion by referencing the question. Either way, it has to be in that final conclusion. Now, the last little bit of this web broadcast is for you to unpack some of the exam questions, because I know some of you have emailed me on and off, and we've talked about it in lessons, and we did some stuff in Easter based on this. Was what is the exam question actually asking me? Because sometimes they can phrase it really difficultly. It looks tricky. You might think, ugh, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some tricky ones. And it's really important to spend, as I said, read through the question at the beginning of the exam, read it through a couple of times. What is it actually asking you to do? Once you get that straight in your head, the rest is easy. So how would you actually structure this particular question? This I don't think is a particularly nice one. If you just looked at it originally straight away, you might think, ugh, that's going to be a nightmare. But looking at it more closely, we know the examine and comment. It means look at some ideas and evaluate them. So it's the AO1 and the AO2 stuff. And it's given you 3 clear areas to talk about, all of which we've discussed. We've looked at the idea of the mind. Is there such thing as a mind? Which is what the hard materialists say, well, no. We've looked at the problem of personal identity. If there is an afterlife, how do we know it's us? And we've looked at the idea of a soul, the idea of the dualist perspective that the soul is a separate entity and therefore can exist independently of the body. So, straightforward. So it's actually asking you, that first long bit before it gives you the 3 areas is saying, can you explain without any major criticism, so any major problems, can you explain that any of those would give you a solution to the mind and body? Does the idea that there is no mind, as in the hard materialist perspective, does that solve the problem of mind and body? Does the problem of personal identity, the fact that it is quite a big problem, does it therefore say, well, actually, there is no separate mind, it is just a physical body, because otherwise we couldn't identify ourselves? And again, the soul, is it such a strong case that we can say, well, actually, yeah, there is a separate mind and body, there is an independent soul, and there is the independent body? That's what it actually wants you to do. So you've got to analyse the information, examine the information, comment on the information, and come to a final conclusion if hard materialism, soft materialism, or dualism as a viewpoint is the answer to the mind and body problem, because you've referred to mind, personal identity, and the idea of a soul throughout examining those 3 key areas. Still a bit worried about it? Well, you shouldn't be. If you really can't figure out an easy way through this and you haven't not been able to follow what I've suggested, you can simply write either of the perfect essays you've done. And all you have to do is to link both forms of materialism to mind. Because remember, the idea that the mind, hard materialism, there is no such thing as a mind. In soft materialism, there is a mind, but it cannot be separated from the body. Dualism to soul, the idea that there is a soul. That's the basic dualist perspective is soul and body, two separate and distinct things. And then the personal identity is the AO2 discussion of if the materialist perspective is right, then yes, okay, personal identity doesn't become a problem. Through dualism, personal identity can be raised as a problem. So it isn't such a horrible exam question as you first think. This one, it may be phrased differently, but actually it's really simple. And some of you actually did say to me in class that you know that you like the quote ones because they do tend to be easier. I think you're quite right on this, as long as they don't give you a really mean quote. So I like this question. Because it's saying the relationship of mind and body can be fully accounted for, it's saying, does materialism explain the relationship of the mind and body? Does soft materialism account for the relationship of mind and body? Does dualism account for the relationship of mind and body? This one's a little bit more tricky because it's saying about essential for understanding personal identity. So for those of you who've struggled in the past with getting your head around personal identity, this one is likely to cause you a bit of grief at the beginning of the exam. But once you actually get there and think it through, and you've done your deep breaths, it'll be fine because you can unpack it and figure it out. It's trying to see how one of your perfect essays, your straightforward essays, can be adapted to fit it. The easiest way to do that with any particular question is to link back to the question after you've examined each of the bits. So write your standard essay and then write one sentence about personal identity. On the next slide, I'm going to show you how personal identity links directly to each of the topics that you would discuss in terms of hard materialism, soft materialism, and dualism. So this is the tricky bits of personal identity. Some final reminders if you're still not quite sure. Personal identity is not an issue at all for any hard materialist. Because hard materialism, Ryle, Dawkins, Hobbes, Bisson, the mind and body are one and the same. There is no such thing as mind and body. We are just a physical entity. So you are just always you throughout this life. And there is nothing after death, so there is no need to worry. So that's how you would do a nice kind of paragraph to link if you've got that previous question. It can be an issue for soft materialism because the bodily resurrection. When you look at the accounts in the Gospels, when Jesus appeared on Easter Sunday to the two Marys in the garden, he wasn't immediately recognised by these two women who were like his closest friends. So why? Why weren't they able to recognise him? That's a question of personal identity. That's a problem with personal identity. He also still had the wounds from his crucifixion. Remember, even to the extent of a few days later, he went to doubting Thomas, who said, I won't believe the Lord has risen until I touch the holes in his hands and I put my hand inside in the where the spears made the hole in his side. So Jesus actually did do that to Thomas. He appeared with all his wounds. Now, as a human being, and you're talked about the idea of resurrection becomes eternal life, are you going to want to be resurrected in the same condition that you died? I know we've laughed about the whole idea that what happened if you were decapitated in an accident or whatever, would you just be a headless body for the rest of the time? All of these things are raised by the problem of personal identity and soft materialism. In terms of immortality in the soul and spiritual resurrection, personal identity is probably, aside from the well, where on earth would it be, is the biggest problem. So how would we be recognised without our physical characteristics? Even such things as your tone of voice, your laughter, all of that relates to your vocal cords, a physical thing. The only bit perhaps that we can say that actually makes us us is how we act, our acts of compassion, love, support, those kind of things. Now, St. Paul in Corinthians lists at length this long description about an afterlife with a spiritual resurrection. He does say we'll have a spiritual body, but there is no real description about what it will be like. So that causes a problem again. Personal identity, as I mentioned before, is a bit of an issue for Hindu beliefs in reincarnation because the memories are meant to be transferred. So who exactly would you be at any given time? And if you achieve moksha, the escape from this cycle of life, death, and rebirth, who are you going to be in that existence? Are you just going to be kind of like this massive muddle of all your different past lives? Or are you just going to be a clean soul? Who knows? And then finally, personal identity isn't really an issue for Buddhism, because Buddhism is all about the idea of rebirth and that every single life is kind of a distinct one. It's an incarnation. So becoming human every single time, there's no suggestion of continuity needed. So the Buddhist belief in reincarnation avoids the issue of personal identity better than any other suggestion of a dualist perspective. So this is me done. Sorry about the wobbles at the start. Hopefully it's recorded okay, and therefore those of you who've not watched it live can watch it okay afterwards. And I hope you did persevere and scroll through and speed through the wobbly bit at the beginning where I was trying to remember how to do this. If you have found it useful, can you leave a comment on the YouTube channel underneath or email me direct? Because it'd be something I might do for you as we progress into the year 13 stuff for future work. So again, keep calm. Good luck for tomorrow. And I'm still available on email even, if you need me. So I'll be thinking of you tomorrow, and I hope you do well, and I hope you found this useful. Good luck.